In the dark halls of Rome's marble palaces, behind heavy curtains and closed doors, feasts began that official chroniclers tried to describe with restraint and sometimes ignored altogether. Where senators' speeches and laws were heard during the day, at night, the floors were flooded with wine and blood. Here, emperors allowed themselves what should not even exist in their fantasies, a combination of wealth, debauchery, and violence. It is no coincidence that many of those who witnessed these scenes left only fragmentary evidence, as if they were afraid to convey the whole truth. Behind the facade of grandeur lay a hell of pleasure and pain, where the human body was turned into a toy and life into a bargaining chip. Already under Tiberius, who inherited power from Augustus, the imperial residence on Capri became a place where boys, girls, prostitutes, slaves, and mutilated captives flocked. Tacitus and Suetonius wrote that Tiberius kept young children with him who were taught depraved games. They were called minones and were supposed to entertain the aging emperor by acting out mythical scenes. But in addition to carnal pleasures, humiliation, torture, and even murder were practiced there, presented as entertainment. The feasts turned into staged performances. The victims did not know that wine and laughter coexisted with the gasps of the dying. Under Caligula, the scale of the orgies became more obvious and terrifying. He did not limit himself to secret gatherings. Night feasts turned into public performances. The emperor organized dinners where senators were forced to bring their wives and daughters and then watch as they were used right before their eyes. For Caligula, this was a way to prove his absolute power. He played with human lives as easily as he played with dice. According to Cassius Dio, during feasts, he would order his guards to suddenly kill one or another participant and then order everyone to continue drinking as if nothing had happened. The bodies of the slain were carried out into the streets, while the laughter in the hall continued unabated. Alcohol and narcotic mixtures occupied a special place at these gatherings. Historians mention rare wines diluted with opium and herbs, which heightened excitement and erased the boundaries of fear. Under the influence of these drinks, people lost their ability to resist. Doctors close to the court recorded strange seizures among the participants of the feasts, which they later interpreted as divine inspiration, although in reality it was the result of intoxication. But this was exactly the state that the organizers needed. Masses of bodies pushed to their limits were convenient material for the wildest experiments. During such feasts, people did not just eat and drink. The table setting itself was part of the spectacle. Instead of the usual dishes of fruit and meat, slaves could be served alive, and the bodies of the victims used as decorations in the interiors. Suetonius noted that Caligula organized meals where scenes of violence were inserted between courses as part of the entertainment. Guests were forced to laugh, applaud, and pretend that it was just theater. Refusal or showing horror could cost them their lives, but the most frightening thing about these nights was that torture and death were presented as a source of pleasure. The emperors and their entourage watched the suffering of others with the same interest with which they viewed rare decorations or paintings. In an era when the Roman Empire prided itself on its culture and laws, scenes reminiscent not of civilization, but of the deepest barbaric cruelty reigned in closed chambers. And while these stories reached the people in a distorted form, as rumors and whispers, for those who were once invited to the feast, it was an experience that left a mark for life. Many of the participants disappeared without a trace, Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber, and their names were erased from the lists. Imperial power needed secrecy, but could not resist demonstrating its permissiveness. Thus, a tradition developed in which sexual lust and bloody reprisals became elements of a political instrument. Each feast became a signal. Here, not only the fate of individual victims is decided, but also the very meaning of power. When a human body becomes expendable, the ruler emphasizes that laws and morality do not exist except for his own desires. This atmosphere of violence and humiliation gradually became the hallmark of the court. Court chroniclers, fearing reprisals, left hints rather than direct descriptions, but these hints form a mosaic that sends a chill down the spine. Behind the masks of grandeur, victories, and triumphs lay nights in which the boundaries of humanity were erased, and Rome became like an arena where the emperor himself played the role of both executioner and god. Nero elevated the art of feasting and orgies to the level of a ritual that combined theater, music, torture, and death. His palace, the Golden House on the Esquiline Hill, resembled a giant stage more than a ruler's residence. Under domes with rotating ceilings from which rose petals rained down, scenes took place that were later whispered about throughout the empire. Here, the emperor himself became both actor and spectator. He would take to the improvised stage in the guise of a singer, and then, inflamed by wine and the enthusiasm of the crowd of slaves and courtiers, he would order the games to begin. These games were rarely limited to music. First, dancers and boys appeared, who were forced to act out scenes from myths, but soon the performance turned into a real bloodbath. According to Tacitus, Nero liked to mix powerful substances into the wine, which caused his guests to lose their bearings. At that moment, the main performance began. Condemned slaves or prisoners were released from their cells, tied to tables, and their bodies became treats. Sometimes the emperor enjoyed watching the wine mix with blood on the marble slabs. For him, it was not cruelty, but a demonstration of his divine power. He considered himself a new Apollo, who had the right to decide who would sing, dance, or die at his feast. Servants recorded that some feasts lasted for several days in a row. The emperor did not allow the lamps to be extinguished, and tired guests were forced to drink and participate in performances. Those who tried to leave or refused were punished immediately. Often, this was symbolic humiliation. Senators were stripped naked and forced to portray gods or animals while the audience laughed. But sometimes the punishment ended in death. Quiet, almost imperceptible when the victim was taken behind a screen and their body was carried away. The so-called feasting executions occupied a special place. Nero ordered the condemned to act out scenes from Greek tragedies. In one of them, the actor playing Hercules had to fight the centaurs, but instead of theatrical weapons, he was given a blunt sword, and his opponents were real gladiators. The spectators, who were intoxicated, perceived what was happening as part of the festivities. When the actor died, his body was not removed immediately. It was left in plain sight, and the guests continued their meal as if death were just another piece of scenery. In Roman society, there was the concept of convivium, a feast as a social and religious ritual. But under Nero, convivium turned into an arena of fear. Wine was mixed with screams, and laughter was accompanied by the gasps of the dying. The emperor himself took part in these scenes, sometimes as a singer, sometimes as a chariot driver, sometimes as the initiator of torture. For him, there was no boundary between art and murder. His artistry was inseparable from blood. After Nero's death, power passed to Vespasian and Titus, but the tradition of bloody pleasures did not disappear. Emperor Domitian, Titus's younger brother, revived the practice of night feasts, where torture and debauchery served not only as entertainment, but also as a tool of control. Domitian feared conspiracy and saw orgies as a way to humiliate and break the elite. He gathered senators and patricians, forcing them to participate in degrading performances. Their wives and daughters were turned into priestesses of the feast, and the men were forced to play the roles of slaves. According to Suetonius, Domitian liked to hold feasts in underground halls, lined with black marble and lit only by torches. There, guests were greeted by naked slaves smeared with animal blood. Instead of flowers, human bones lay on the tables, and the tableware was made in the shape of skulls. The atmosphere of fear was part of the plan. Everyone understood that they might not come out alive. These feasts were called Sinae Tenebricosai, meals of darkness. During such gatherings, the emperor often staged mock executions, which sometimes turned out to be real. The victims were prisoners, slaves, or random participants. They could be tied up, doused with resin, and set on fire, turning them into living torches to light the hall. The spectacle was horrifying, but the guests were obliged to feign delight. Laughter, applause, and toasts drowned out the cries of the victims. Those who could not bear it and showed fear were accused of disloyalty and punished. Medical treatises of the time mentioned strange illnesses among participants in such gatherings: exhaustion, hallucinations, psychosis. Doctors linked them to the constant consumption of wine mixed with narcotic herbs, as well as to mental stress, but the imperial court ignored these warnings. For the rulers, the body of a subject was merely a vessel that could be broken to assert their power. Thus, Roman orgies gradually became a system in which pleasure did not exist separately from pain. Power turned intimacy into a demonstration of strength and feasting into a political act. Every participant understood that attending such gatherings was both a privilege and a mortal threat. Those who laughed alongside the emperor today could become part of the decoration tomorrow. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, went down in history not as a philosopher on the throne, but as a ruler who turned Rome into an arena for his own whims. His feasts and orgies became a continuation of circus games. The emperor not only watched the deaths, but also entered the arena himself as a gladiator. The same motifs could be seen in his nightly feasts. Commodus organized banquets where, instead of musicians, prisoners in chains were forced to sing while being flogged. When their voices gave out, they were replaced by new victims. For the guests, it was a show, but everyone understood that disobedience, or even a simple display of pity, could be perceived as treason. Commodus had a particular passion for feasting murders. During a meal, he would suddenly grab a weapon and strike a random slave or even a freedman. The corpses were not removed until the feast was over. Wine flowed alongside blood, and no one dared to stop the madman. Suetonius wrote that the emperor took pleasure in watching the blood mix with the expensive sauces on the tables. These scenes reinforced the feeling of complete impunity. For Commodus, power meant the right to destroy lives at will, and for those around him, the need to participate in this silent spectacle. Even more shocking were the feasts of Heliogabalus, a young Syrian emperor who ascended the throne at the beginning of the 3rd century. His name became synonymous with debauchery and religious madness. Heliogabalus brought Eastern cults to Rome, where naked rituals and bloody sacrifices were intertwined with sexual perversions. He held feasts where guests suffocated under rose petals. The ceilings of the hall were equipped with hidden mechanisms, and flowers rained down in such quantities that participants sometimes died of suffocation. But even this was not considered a tragedy. Rather, it was seen as the host's exquisite amusement. Heliogabalus was famous for his particular perverse taste for humiliating the Roman nobility. He forced senators and patricians into the roles of slaves and prostitutes, made men portray women, and women participate in the rituals of the Eastern sun cult. Wine and food were accompanied by torture and sexual abuse, which were presented as sacrifices to the gods. Sources report that on these nights, the emperor often appeared before the assembled guests in women's clothing and demanded to be addressed as a priestess. Gender and status were erased, and humiliation became the norm. One of Heliogabalus's most monstrous entertainments were the wedding feasts that he held dozens of times, each time choosing a new husband or wife from among his courtiers or slaves. These marriages were accompanied by bloody ceremonies. Sacrificial animals and sometimes even people were sacrificed before the eyes of the guests. Scenes of sexual violence and murder became the culmination of the meal. Contemporaries wrote that many tried to refuse to participate, but this was impossible. Refusal was considered a mortal challenge to the emperor. Medical treatises of the time recorded an increase in diseases associated with such nights. Syphilis, blood poisoning, mental disorders. Doctors described accidental deaths from exhaustion and poisoning, but in official chronicles, this was presented as the will of the gods. The authorities turned even illness and death into an element of the ritual. Over time, these practices became a symbol of the end. The late Roman Empire was plunging into chaos, and feasts saturated with debauchery and blood became a reflection of the collapse of the state. For emperors, orgies were not just entertainment, but a way to show that they were above human laws, above morality, and even above life itself. At these feasts, the body ceased to be a body and became an object of power demonstration. Every scream, every drop of blood, every act of humiliation was part of the political scene. And that is why the memory of these nights has been preserved not in the form of detailed reports, but in the form of frightening hints and dark legends, which for centuries have cemented Rome's image as a city where grandeur coexisted with monstrous decline. Gradually, the feasts ceased to be merely an instrument of humiliation and pleasure. They became a deadly trap for the rulers themselves. The participants in the orgies lived in constant fear. No one knew who would be the next victim, whose body would become a decoration on the table or a torch in the marble hall. But along with fear, hatred also grew. The courtiers, senators, and even the guards understood that their lives depended on a single whim. Thus, conspiracies were born, motivated not so much by political motives as by the desire to survive. Commodus, absorbed in his own games, did not notice that those who were tired of endless humiliation were gathering around him. His murder at the end of the 2nd century was not a high-profile battle for power, but a quiet elimination of a madman who had become a threat even in the eyes of his own supporters. Contemporaries wrote that he did not die in the arena or in his luxurious chambers, but was strangled by a slave wrestler in the bath, as if his death itself was a reflection of the amusements with which he humiliated others. For Rome, this was a signal. The emperor, whose feasts were drenched in blood, himself fell victim to the fear he inspired. Heliogabalus also ended his life at the tip of hatred. His feasts, filled with Eastern rituals and violence, finally alienated the Roman nobility. The senators and praetorians, tired of endless humiliation, finally rebelled. The emperor, barely 19 years old, was torn apart by his own soldiers. His body was first desecrated in the streets, dragged through the mud, and then thrown into the Tiber. For those who had participated in his feasts, it was a liberation, but also a reminder. Power built on debauchery and blood could not last forever. The same fate befell many others. Domitian was stabbed in his own palace, betrayed by the slaves and guards he once trusted. Caligula fell at the hands of officers who were tired of seeing their families become playthings at banquets. Even Tiberius, a wise politician, lived under constant guard in his later years, fearing poisoning or a knife attack. Orgies and nightly feasts, created as a demonstration of power, gradually became a source of weakness. Each feast was a reminder that the emperor was not a man, but a monster, and monsters can be destroyed. Gradually, a special culture of fear developed in Rome. An invitation to a feast was no longer considered a privilege. It became a sentence that could not be refused. Senators and generals came to halls that smelled of wine and blood, and each of them had one thought in mind. Will I make it out of here alive? Many prepared in advance. They wrote wills, hid their families, and bribed slaves so that their names would not be erased from the chronicles. The psychological pressure on the elite proved devastating. A state where rulers used humiliation and death as entertainment could not maintain stability. The more the emperors emphasized their power through feasts, the faster the very foundation of that power crumbled. The courtiers swore allegiance in public, but secretly sought ways to get rid of their master. Rome was becoming like a red-hot cauldron. On the outside, it shone with marble and victories, but on the inside, decay and fear were eating away at its foundations. Feasts became a symbol not of grandeur, but of vulnerability. Every new scandal, every orgy with corpses and torches made from human bodies, became a topic of conversation among the people. The Romans saw that their rulers had lost touch with reality. People whispered, comparing the emperors not to gods, but to monsters. These whispers turned into conspiracies, and conspiracies turned into murders. Historians who wrote about those times emphasized that the fear of the pyramids was no less than the fear of war. Roman citizens knew that one crazy feast in the imperial palace could cost the lives of dozens of people and turn into a political crisis. The power that was once built on law and discipline turned into a bloody spectacle where there were no rules. And the deeper the empire sank into this abyss, the clearer it became. Feasts, which once symbolized wealth and luxury, had become an instrument of self-destruction. Emperors drinking wine from cups made of skulls were themselves bringing closer the moment when their heads would end up in the hands of conspirators. After the death of the most insane emperors, their feasts did not disappear along with their bodies, thrown into the Tiber or stabbed in dark chambers. On the contrary, the memory of them became part of the collective horror that the state itself experienced. The chronicles compiled by monks and Christian authors of late antiquity turned scenes of debauchery and torture into proof of Rome's inevitable collapse. For the Church, these stories were a convenient weapon. They showed that the empire, proud of its laws and philosophy, was in fact drowned in blood and lust. Stories about the nightly feasts of Caligula, Nero, Commodus, and Heliogabalus were rewritten, commented on, and passed on as examples of the Great Fall. It no longer mattered whether they were described accurately or embellished. What mattered was the image. The emperor, sitting at a marble table, smeared with wine and the blood of slaves, became a symbol of Rome in decline. For Christian authors, this was an argument. A civilization where the human body is turned into a toy cannot survive. The memory of these feasts lived on in architecture. The ruins of the palaces where bloody feasts were held became places of pilgrimage and damnation. Frescoes and inscriptions hinting at scenes of orgies were found in Roman underground chambers. Even the marble tables found by archaeologists bore traces of strange cuts and holes, probably for securing victims. Late antique historians recorded that people were afraid to approach these ruins. They were considered cursed. Christian tradition reinforced this image. In their sermons, the Church Fathers spoke of feasts of the devil, where rulers renounced their humanity. Legends that emperors drank wine from human skulls, that torches made from bodies burned in the halls, that innocent children became toys of the gods, became indisputable evidence. In people's minds, Rome forever remained a city where luxury and vice merged. Medieval chroniclers picked up on these images, adding even more horror. For them, stories of Roman orgies were not only history, but also a warning. In Europe, where the Church controlled people's minds, the images of Nero and Heliogabalus became symbols of the Antichrist. Their feasts were described as rituals of devil worship, and the deaths of their victims as sacrifices. Thus, Rome became a metaphor for eternal evil, and the memory of its feasts became part of the culture. But behind the legends lies a cold reality. These feasts really did exist, albeit in different forms. Sources from ancient authors, archaeological finds, medical treatises, and eyewitness accounts confirm that for part of the Roman elite, humiliation and pain were the usual language of power. What the people perceived as rumors actually reflected a perverted system where violence had become commonplace. Even centuries later, the memory of them was used as an argument against excessive luxury. The revival of interest in antiquity during the Renaissance was accompanied by fear. Writers recalled not only Caesar and Marcus Aurelius, but also Nero, who burned Rome, and Heliogabalus, who suffocated his guests under rose petals. These images continued to frighten people, forming the idea that the fall of an empire is inevitable if power turns into debauchery. Thus, the feasts of the Roman emperors turned out to be not just a page in history, but a symbol of how absolute power destroys humanity, a symbol of how greatness can coexist with a monstrous fall, and a symbol of how a civilization built on blood and humiliation is doomed. And even today, when archaeologists extract fragments of marble and bones from the ground, the shadow of those nights continues to live on. It reminds us that behind the marble columns and golden domes of the empire lay darkness, where wine was red not only from grapes, and laughter rang out through the gasps of the dying. It is this memory that has made Rome eternal, not in its greatness, but in its fall.